which is an absolute disaster for the patient. Hence, we are experts in gastric emptying.
Now, if I may take you to triple K2, that is your report. Do you confirm the correctness of your report?
I do, my lady.
Now, Professor, I'm not going to lead your evidence in detail. I would ask you to take the court through your report and explain it to the court.
Certainly, my lady. One of the most serious complications that may occur during general anesthesia is the regurgitation of stomach contents into the pharynx with consequent aspiration into the lungs. And it's an absolute disaster if and when it happens. There are numerous measures which can be employed to prevent this. One of which is to take steps to try and ensure that the patient's stomach is empty when they come to the operating theatre. So with emergency cases, trauma cases, head injured patients, etc., there's very little one can do. You need to anticipate that the stomach is full and go ahead and anesthetize the patient, taking into account that this is an added risk of anesthetizing the patient. But with elective surgery, we can take into account our guidelines, of which there are many international guidelines. I've only included in the bundle the European guidelines, but there are many guidelines. They're all very similar. Australian, European, American. We don't have a document documenting our South African guidelines, but we abide by the same guidelines as the other countries. And the two areas that we concentrate on are defining the timing, content, and the volume of the patient's intake prior to anesthesia, and we refer to that as the last oral intake, and we will then use the terminology nil per os, so nil per mouth, when the patient comes to theatre, and then ascertaining and taking into account all the factors that make head injury can have a full stomach up to 24 hours after that head injury, despite the fact that they've not taken anything orally during that 24 hours, simply because of the physiological factors and within the body that cause the delay in the stomach to empty. So we do fasting guidelines, which most international and local guidelines recommend apply to clear fluids and then to solid foods. Clear fluids is defined in anesthetic terms as something one can read newsprint through. So for example, clear apple juice, weak black tea, water, something that you can hold in terms as something one can read newsprint through. So for example, clear apple juice, weak black tea, water, something that you can hold a newspaper behind and still read the 2 hours before, because the stomach empties very rapidly after dehydrated when they come to theatre. So patients are encouraged to have clear fluid. When it comes to solid foods, the studies are very difficult to perform, looking at solid food to measure the way that the stomach empties solid foods or gets rid of solid foods into the individuals. My lady, 10% of a low-fat meal will remain in the stomach after 4 hours. So many patients who have come for operations will know that the anesthesiologist has said to them, you may have solid food in the stomach after 4 hours. He hopes that the stomach is empty after that 6-hour period. Other contents of the meal or of the food at 6-hour period. And then a high-fat content is broccoli, celery, cabbage. A lot of those vegetables are undigested. The content of the food is incredibly important in determining how much physiology it fits. And I'm based at Chris Elective Surgery, and as I was putting her to sleep, She regurgitated green stomach contents, and unfortunately it went into her lungs, and she went to intensive care unit afterwards, and she was fine. But it's even with the best intentions, she still had not emptied her stomach and had no good reason not to have emptied her stomach after 8 hours. And if I chat to colleagues, they've all had similar experiences. So it's not an exact science, unfortunately. The other factors that may affect the emptying of the stomach are, I've called them endogenous and exogenous factors. Endogenous are within the body, exogenous are from the outside of the body. And as I've already mentioned, the content and volume of food intake. There are many neurological, emotional, and hormone interactions, my lady, that may delay gastric emptying. Pain and anxiety in particular, and we are faced with that on a daily basis with our preoperative patients coming to theatre, because a lot of them are very anxious and some of them may be in pain, and that also delays gastric emptying. It's been found, or it's been thought in very recently, that premenopausal women, depending on at what stage of the cycle they're in, may have delayed gastric emptying, which was a factor not known previously.
Now, premenopausal, when would that be?
Which
stage?
Before the menopause, young women. Sleep delays gastric emptying. That's an accepted fact. And in particular, sleeping in the left lateral. Smoking delays gastric emptying. Alcohol may increase or delay gastric emptying. The literature seems to favor the delaying gastric emptying by alcohol. And then there are many disease states, such as diabetes mellitus, gastrointestinal diseases, that delay gastric emptying. Psychological disorders such as bulimia nervosa and anorexia nervosa show significant delay in gastric emptying. And then a lot of medications may delay gastric emptying. Prescription medications such as opiates, which are morphine-type drugs, tricyclic antidepressants. Many patients are on antidepressants. Some diabetic medication and selected gastrointestinal drugs, and many of the slimming drugs, which are now prescription drugs, those with pseudoephedrine in them also delay gastric emptying. Recreational drugs, marijuana and cocaine, both delay gastric emptying. And many of the over-the-counter slimming medicines, the herbal medicines, and I read a recent article where it stated that 25% of our patients coming to theatre are taking some form of herbal medication. And many of those, so St. John's wort, a lot of the over-the-counter herbal medicines, and a lot of those also delay gastric emptying, my lady. Do you want me to continue? I was asked to comment on the gastric contents found at autopsy in the late Reeva Steenkamp. Now, my lady, I'd like to say at the outset that I'm a clinician. I'm a practicing clinician. I'm not a forensic pathologist, but I was asked to comment on the gastric contents that were found. And as I've already alluded to, the volume of gastric contents after a meal varies from person to person. It can vary from day to day in the same person, and is dependent on many factors which I've enumerated. The evidence that I've been given to read from this court case indicates that the late Reeva Steenkamp ate a chicken stir-fried dinner at approximately 1900 to 2000 hours on the evening of the 13th of February last year. And this is my opinion purely, but are based on my expertise and my reading. Factors that may have affected gastric emptying are as follows. The meal may have contained insoluble fiber, which would have delayed gastric emptying. She was a premenopausal woman, which may have delayed gastric emptying. It is not known whether she was taking any medication, herbal or prescription. She had performed yoga exercises that evening, and exercise does delay gastric emptying, but I'm not sure how energetic that exercise was. It is unclear to me whether she had tendencies towards bulimia nervosa or anorexia nervosa, and she went to sleep, and as I've already alluded to, sleep delays gastric emptying. I've then stated that in the ideal world, my lady, after 6 hours of fasting, after this meal, her stomach should probably have been empty. But there are so many unknowns about possible factors that could have delayed gastric emptying that one cannot state it as being a fact, and I would say it would be purely speculative.
I specifically asked you to look at the post-mortem, but there was no reference to gastric emptying at the time of the post-mortem.
No. So in summary, my lady, the presence of gastric contents after a meal is dependent on the volume and the content of the meal and a host of other vital factors, as I've indicated. It is thus speculative to attempt to estimate when the late Ms. Steenkamp's food intake occurred based purely on the presence of gastric contents.
Professor, you also indicated that you did not isolate your report from any other experts. You had some discussion.
I did have discussion. I had discussion with the gastroenterology colleagues because our areas, our fields cross, and there's, they're concerned with gastric emptying, we're concerned with gastric emptying, and he thought my report was very accurate.
But and that is just hearsay. I just don't know why Mr. Ru would even attempt to lead that evidence. That is pure hearsay.
Well, I don't think you could have, envisaged that she would say, yes. I went to speak to a colleague. I don't blame Mr. Ru, but may I just say I've checked the evidence. Yes. It's pure hearsay. Yes, yes.
I would accept that. Yes. Professor, the articles that you referred to, the two publications, am I correct? We don't have to read it out, but they basically support what you've said. Yeah?
Yes, my lady.
Thank you, my lady. I have no further questions.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Nana.
Lady, we've received the report today. I'll start, but I might request just an adjournment after a couple of questions.
All right. Before you do that, I just want to mention that that piece of evidence that was hearsay is expunged from the record.
That's good, please, my lady. Thank you very much. Madam, let me start by saying I think your evidence is balanced, and I don't have lots of differences or differences of opinion, but there's a couple of things that I think we'll have to test. Do you understand that? I'm not fighting with you. I just think that we'll have to go through certain things. Do you understand that?
I understand that, my lady.
Have you read Professor Simon's evidence?
I have, my lady.
Good. Then certainly you've seen what he said at page 517, and you don't have to remember the page number, but it's important that we just go through his evidence at 517.
Sorry, my lady, where will I find it?
We will make it available.
Okay, thank you.
May I just then, whilst they're making that available, just say that in your comment on the facts of the matter, you've listed certain issues that may have delayed gastric emptying.
Correct, my lady.
Now, you don't know if it existed except that she was menopausal.
Correct, my lady.
But the rest you don't know if it existed. You just mentioned a list that the court should take into account.
My lady, I have seen in the court transcript that the evidence that a chicken stir fry was eaten.
That's true, but we're talking about delay of gastric emptying.
Okay.
So the factors you listed there, just factors you say court may take into account.
Correct, my lady.
But that's speculative because it's based on nothing that you have in the record. For instance, medication, you don't know.
I have already stated that, my lady.
Illnesses you don't know.
I've already stated that.
So what I'm saying is those are speculative.
Correct, my lady.
Good. Now let us just look at 517. Do you have it with you?
I do, my lady.
I will guide you through it, and I would just... Can I just ask you, have you read Professor Butta's evidence?
I have, my lady.
It's the same question that I asked him, so it won't be that difficult for you to deal with. Professor Simon said at 517, around about line 20, that gastric emptying is not an exact science. You agree with that?
I agree with that, my lady.
He said, in other words, there are varying time frames that may be implicated for the emptying of the stomach. Is that correct?
That's correct, my lady.
He said there may be inter-individual variations and intra-individual variations. You agree with that?
I agree with that, my lady.
But he said that there are indeed fairly good timelines which have been established from a physiological perspective. And you've mentioned that. 4 hours and 6 hours.
Correct, my lady.
Good. And you also agree, and I'm just going through his evidence, see if you agree with what he said next. One of the reasons why this particular topic has been well studied in medicine is primarily because surgeons and anesthetists do not like to operate on people that have recently had something to eat because it can compromise the patient if they were to have foodstuff in the stomach and they were to regurgitate or aspirate this food. You said the same thing.
Correct, my lady.
So you agree with him. Then you also agree with him, I'm sure, we now at line 11. So for a surgeon, it's important to know that the patient has not eaten for 3 or 4 hours. Therefore, it's likely that the stomach is empty and it's safe to operate.
My lady, if one looks at the KKK3 document, excuse me, that has been handed in, it is thought amongst anesthesiologists, and the consensus amongst anesthesiologists is that solid food, 4 hours for solid food may well be insufficient, and that a minimum of 6 hours is required.
Oh, let us then, we'll get to that, the question. So as far as this statement of his is concerned, you would say a minimum of 6 hours.
Correct, my lady.
Good. Then he said, it's a bit down on line 23, at page 518, line 23. He said, one should take into account the kind of food that has been eaten. You will agree that that is important as far as the gastric emptying is concerned?
My lady, insofar as the fat and carbohydrate content and insoluble fiber content, yes.
And he deals with that in page 519, lines 4. Fatty foods would remain in the stomach. Sorry, are you there, Professor?
I have it, my lady.
Fatty foods would remain in the stomach for a long period of time, the longest of all, and solids would remain longer as well. The next factor that will impact upon the length of duration of the stomach, food being retained in the stomach, would probably be the volume of food.
Correct, my lady.
But even if one takes that into account, anesthetists all over the world, specifically in South Africa, would be happy that after 6 hours the stomach would be empty, after the meal.
My lady, that's a two-edged sword, and in reality, the answer is yes. However, we tend, because we're so obsessed with safety and because we're so obsessed with this issue, if you're coming for afternoon surgery, we will usually say have something at 5 a.m. that morning and you'll be operated on any time from 1 o'clock onwards. So that is 6 hours. However, if you are first on an operating list at 8 o'clock in the morning, you will have been starved from 10 o'clock the previous night, or maybe even 8 o'clock the previous night. So we even though we say six hours is the absolute cutoff, because we are very conservative, we may try and make it a longer period, as long as the patient has had clear fluids and is not becoming dehydrated.
We will deal with all this. I just want to go through its evidence. So, in fact, you said in reality you agree that after 6 hours it would be empty, but you would rather err on the side of safety and wait longer.
Correct.
But in reality, daily, hundreds of operations are undertaken with a 6-hour time frame as the guide.
I'm not sure where Mr. Nell gets his facts from, my lady, but I don't think one can say hundreds of operations are done with 6 hours of starvation from solids, because in the provincial sector, our patients are starved from 6 o'clock the night before. So I do think that it does vary, and we do tend to err on the side of conservative.
Now, let us just carry on. I know that's not your area of expertise, but Professor Simon at page 520 dealt with the gastric emptying post-mortem after death.
That is not my area of expertise,
Okay.
my lady.
That's fine. Now, Madam, before I ask for adjournment, let me just ask you one question. If we have an 8-hour delay, or 8 hours passed, since the deceased in this matter had the meal, because I cross-examined, and if you read the record, I cross-examined the accused and I said 8 o'clock, he moved it closer to 7 the previous evening. She had a meal. She died, was shot. Let's make it at 3. It's after 3, but let's make it at 3. You've seen the photographs of the gastric content?
I've seen one photograph.
Of the gastric content?
It was a photograph of some green gelatinous. That's all I've seen.
Okay. But you would expect her stomach to be empty. If she wasn't abnormal, if that was just a normal person that had something to eat, went to bed, after 8 hours you would have expected the stomach to be empty. In normal circumstances. Don't look for exceptions.
No, my lady, I understand from the evidence that I've seen that the meal was a chicken stir fry, and we know that stir fries have vegetables in them, and if there was undigestible fiber in the vegetables, I don't think anybody can categorically state that her stomach would have been empty after 8 hours. As has been said in Professor Simon's report, it varies from person to person, day to day. The late Reva Steenkamp was premenopausal, and she had been asleep, as far as I understand the evidence. So I don't think one can be that categorical, my lady.
You see, what is exceptional about the stir-fry meal? What that other patients would not take. What is exceptional about a stir-fry meal? There's nothing exceptional. Normal people would daily have similar kind of food. Am I right?
I don't understand the question, my lady.
Why would you not understand the question? Why would you say the fact that she had a stir-fry meal we should take into account? Why?
My lady, as I've just said, if it contained vegetables with insoluble fiber, that may have delayed gastric emptying. In addition, she was asleep.
Now, Madam, so are you saying that would have been the delay in the gastric emptying would have been more severe or longer because of a stir fry than any other meal?
It may be. It's not an exact science, as Professor Simon said in his testimony, my lady.
So, I'm sure you haven't warned your patients not to have stir fry. No, and you know, it's not a joke. It's just something that you said, and I'm testing you on it. And I'm not trying to be funny. But you haven't warned your patients not to have stir fry. And now you want to say that that's important.
My lady, I warn my patients to have a light meal. And that is exactly what I warn them.
Now, let us just say, Professor Simon, during postmortem, were able to identify vegetable matter. That is an indication of the process of gastric emptying, isn't it? If you're able to still identify the vegetables, it means that the process of emptying hasn't been long. Am I right?
I can't say that, my lady.
Why not? If you eat...
I can say the stomach is not empty.
But doesn't digestion alter the physical nature of the food over time?
It does, unless it's insoluble.
Yeah, but not if it's... But if it's... Okay, let us just use what you said. We're talking after 8 hours. Are you saying that after 8 hours, one would still be able to identify the food?
My lady, could I be shown the evidence where the food was identified?
Madam, you saw the photograph. I'll show it to you again. The question is different, madam. The question is, Professor Simon said he was able to identify it, and it's in the record. I just have to find it in the record where he said what he was able to find. Stomach content, page 517. And that was included in his postmortem. Now, what is important about this, and I read it to you now, is Professor Simon did this postmortem on the 15th of February. The accused corroborated his finding a year later in his evidence that it was vegetable matter. So, the professor was, on the day after the event, able to identify the stomach content as having contained vegetable matter without knowing what she had to eat. So let's just deal with that. Do you take that? Just take that into mind when we read it. Page 10 line 10 at page 517. The stomach contains approximately 200 milliliters of partially digested food residue with the appearance of primarily vegetable matter and with slightly green and grey color. And with a slightly green and grey color, in which whitish cheese-like particles may be seen. So he was able to identify the meal she had the day after the event. That's now been corroborated. Would you not have expected if she ate at 7 for him not to be able to identify it?
I can't say that, my lady, because high fat containing, we know that if those were white cheesy particles, and I can only go on what I can read in the transcript, my lady, but cheese can be a high fat meal, and that can take a long time to empty. As can, may I finish, my lady?
Please do, I apologize.
As can insoluble fiber. So I'm not sure what Advocate Null is asking me, my lady.
What I'm asking you, madam, is would you not have expected the digestive process to have caused the contents of the stomach to be unrecognizable after 8 hours?
I can't comment on that, my lady.
Okay. But he can, and he did. Then there's one other aspect. Professor Simon gave evidence that post-mortem, let me just get that. And I want you also to take that into account when we come back, really, is that Professor Simon testified at page 520, my lady, that post-mortem, after death, the gastric emptying stops. But the physical breakdown of the food, the digestion, because of the enzyme and the hydrochloric acid, etc., that continues breaking down the food. Do you have a view on this?
My lady, as I've already said, I'm a clinician. I deal with live patients, and I have immense respect for Professor Simon, who is a forensic pathologist and his patients are deceased. I tried to find information, however, on the enzymes continuing to work in the post-mortem period, especially if the body is refrigerated. Because I was surprised at the comment that enzymes and digestive juices would continue to work at a refrigerated temperature, and I was unable to find any evidence either way. So I'm not a forensic pathologist and I don't wish to comment.
But we can make it easier for you. Although the deceased died in the vicinity of 3 o'clock, she remained on the scene for hours later. So before she was refrigerated, she remained on the scene. It was hours later that the first refrigeration took place. So that should also be taken into account as far as the breakdown of the digestive process is concerned. And that would have affected.
Okay, can you just be specific? How many hours would that be?
Well, I have the time. The time is 11:45 that the deceased body was handed over to the mortuary. I'll check this, and I'm sure Mr. Rue will check me up on it, but that's the time I have.
Thank you.
So, madam, if you take that all into account, the mere fact that Professor Simon was able to identify vegetable matter must indicate that the last meal was not at sea.
My lady, that's Professor Simon's opinion.
You see, I have it in a record, but you see, in a handbook handed in by the defence, it's the handbook of Jason Payne James et al. That confirms it was handed in by the defence. I don't have the exhibit number, but I've got it in the record. It's easier. On the record, I can identify it where I asked Professor Simon, and then we're all on the same page. You see, I've just been reminded that although you look in the literature for it, the defence provided the proof that digestion does not stop at when a patient dies. And my lady, I will find it.
My lady, I'm not aware of this.
Yeah. No, if you're not aware of it, I'm going to ask for a short adjournment. I'll come back. I'll give you the handbook, and then so you'll be able to see for yourself. My lady, may I just then ask? May I ask for half an hour, my lady, just to be able to consult with Professor Simon and to finalise the
Yes. What's the time now?
cross-examination.
What's the time?
It's 11:15. 10:15, my lady.
You want us back at 11:15?
Indeed.
Thank you. Court will adjourn.
Kan je al 5 en kort hem